Hello everyone, and welcome to The Harvester. These notebooks aren't just old records, they're artifacts from a closed nursing home, and the story they contain is one you won't forget. So put on your headphones, turn off the lights, and listen carefully. Enjoy. I don't know who you are, or why you're listening to this, but from this moment on, I'm asking for just one thing: to pay attention to the details, to strange sensations in your own body, to movements you brush off as fatigue, to brief moments of discomfort that feel random. What I'm about to tell you doesn't sound dangerous at first, and that's what makes it unsettling. Nothing started suddenly. There was no pain, no screaming, no obvious threat. Just a quiet sense that familiar things were behaving slightly differently than before. This isn't a story about monsters, and it isn't an urban legend. And if, after this, you catch yourself listening to your body more carefully than usual, then I've told it the right way. I'll start from the time when my friend and I still believed we were in control, when nothing felt truly dangerous yet. My name is Michael. I was 21 at the time. I lived in a small town in the northeastern United States and was attending college. Money was always tight, so I worked part-time as a delivery driver on evening and night shifts. I knew the city best at those hours-empty parking lots, closed gas stations, and dim lights glowing behind apartment windows. My friend's name was Daniel. He was 21 as well and lived in the building across from mine. He studied engineering and worked as an intern for a company that serviced security systems. He had access to places most people weren't allowed into, and he firmly believed that anything strange could be explained. He didn't believe in the supernatural, hated panic, and always thought things through before speaking. We also shared a hobby exploring abandoned places. We'd already been inside closed schools, old hospitals, and deserted industrial sites. No reckless thrill-seeking. We went in, looked around, and left. That's why, when Daniel mentioned an abandoned nursing home outside town, a place that was officially guarded, yet barely mentioned in any public records, it didn't sound like a scary story. It sounded like a gap, and gaps were something we never liked to leave unexplored. Daniel didn't tell me about the place right away. At first, he mentioned it casually, like it was nothing important. He said that in the system of properties he had access to through work, there was a closed nursing home outside town. Officially, it was listed as decommissioned. In reality, it was under guard, with no clear reason why. We started looking into it together. There was almost no official information. A few dry references in local public health reports, and even fewer mentions in city news archives. The facility had been shut down after a series of resident deaths. No cause was ever determined. That exact wording appeared in every document, as if someone had deliberately reused the same sentence. Before the closure, staff had documented dermatological complications: itching, rashes, strange subdermal swellings. At first, none of it was treated as serious. The patients were elderly, most with chronic conditions, and the symptoms were blamed on age and weakened immune systems. Standard treatments were prescribed. They didn't work. Over time, the deaths began. Not all at once, no sudden outbreak, just a steady, unsettling pattern. Those whose condition was considered stable were transferred to other facilities. After that, the building was shut down quickly, without explanations and without public statements. Some of the documentation disappeared even before the place was officially sealed. Certain observation logs were never found. Others stopped abruptly halfway through. The building was put under guard, but not as a hazardous site or a crime scene. More like a place no one wanted to return to. The nursing home was privately owned. That meant the city kept its distance, and no one was in a hurry to ask questions. That was what unsettled us. Not the deaths themselves, but how carefully the traces had been cleared away, and how much was still left behind, locked inside. This time, we didn't prepare as if it were anything serious. Everything was thrown together quickly. 2 flashlights with fresh batteries, an old crowbar Daniel tossed into the trunk, a backpack, and a length of rope, more for reassurance than for any specific reason. I added a small first aid kit out of habit. It rarely came in handy, but it made me feel better. We left late, well after midnight. The road to the building ran through an industrial zone and then narrowed into a strip of asphalt along the edge of the woods. The headlights cut through the dark, catching road signs that hadn't been updated in years and empty turnoffs no one used anymore. We barely talked. Not because we were scared, there was just nothing to say. We spotted the security from a distance. A single vehicle parked near the main entrance, a faint light glowing inside. Daniel took the lead immediately. He knew how night patrols worked, where guards usually stopped, how long they stayed in one place. We waited in the car with the headlights off until the light disappeared. Getting inside was easier than I expected. The service entrance was locked, but barely reinforced. Daniel worked quickly and silently. When the door finally gave way, the sound felt too loud, and we froze, counting the seconds and listening. Inside, the building didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused in time. The furniture was still in place, the curtains drawn, faded signs hanging on the walls. The air was dry, carrying the sharp smell of old plastic, dust, and something distinctly medical. There were no signs of decay, but there was a sense that people had been taken out of here in a hurry. In those first minutes, I became aware of a strange tension in my body, as if it were waiting for something specific, but couldn't tell what. Daniel moved ahead, checking corridors, signaling when to stop. He looked focused and calm, like this was just another empty site we'd walked into before. What I didn't know then was that the worst part wasn't waiting deeper inside. It was already there. It just hadn't made itself known yet. We started in the administrative wing. It was quieter there than in the residential corridors, and the beam of our flashlights didn't get lost in long hallways. In a small office lined with metal cabinets, Daniel stopped first. He opened one of them. Inside were notebooks, ordinary ones, with worn covers, labeled by hand names, dates, room numbers, medical records. I flipped through a few pages and immediately understood these weren't standard charts. The writing was uneven, sometimes rushed, like it had been done by people who were exhausted and short on time. The symptoms repeated, but the wording changed slightly each time. In another cabinet, we found a box of videotapes. Dates and brief notes were written on the labels in marker. No titles, no explanations. Beside it lay a separate, thin journal, not tied to individual patients. There were no names, just days of observation and lists of changes in condition. It looked like a summary, an attempt to piece something together. That's when it became clear this wasn't an archive meant for reporting or forgotten storage. It felt more like private notes kept by medical staff trying to understand what was happening. I felt a strange reluctance to keep touching the pages, but I kept reading anyway. The first entry in that thin journal was the shortest. No details, no conclusions, just a few lines describing a patient's initial sensations. The final sentence was underlined. Movement without pain at first. I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because there was something unsettlingly calm about the way it was written, as if the person who wrote it didn't yet know what they were trying to describe. We read in silence, page after page. The notes didn't feel like an attempt to scare anyone, more like an effort to precisely document something that didn't fit into normal descriptions. In nearly every patient, the first symptom was itching, not sharp, not constant. It was described as a background sensation that couldn't be localized, as if the skin were reacting for no clear reason. Then came references to movement. At first, the wording was vague. A strange sensation under the skin, as if something is shifting. Doctors tried to explain it away as muscle spasms, nerve responses, age-related sensory issues. But over time, the entries grew more specific. Patients described a slow crawling sensation not on the surface, but deeper, between muscles, beneath tissue, between organs. Not sudden, not painful. It was simply there. Bulges began to appear. Small lumps under the skin that could be felt but not always seen. In some cases, they lasted for hours. In others, they disappeared within minutes, only to reappear somewhere else. The notebooks recorded these separately, noting time and location, as if trying to catch a pattern. None ever emerged. What was most disturbing was how patients described the sensation itself. Almost all of them wrote that it wasn't painful at first. It was uncomfortable, wrong, as if the body were doing something it shouldn't. Pain came later, but it was secondary. What mattered was the awareness of movement inside, the sense that something was shifting, avoiding pressure, changing direction. In later entries, both the number and size of the bulges increased. The movement became more frequent, less predictable. Patients stopped sleeping normally. They listened to their bodies constantly, trying to track where it was happening now. Some wrote that the worst part wasn't the pain, but the waiting. The moment when you know it's going to start again, but have no idea when. I closed the notebook and realized we hadn't been reading about an illness for a long time. We were reading about the gradual loss of the body as something stable. And according to the logic of these records, something worse was supposed to come next. Daniel and I exchanged a look and opened another notebook for a surface review. This time, we came across hastily written conclusions from forensic pathologists. How they'd made their way into the facility was unclear. The reports were dry, emotionless, and somehow that made them worse. During autopsies, damage to internal organs had been found, tissue that appeared partially eaten or marked by small bite-like patterns. Not random, selective. That was what led to premature death. Yet every report repeated the same conclusion. No foreign organisms were found in the body. No parasites. No larvae. Nothing that could be shown or removed. In a separate notebook were notes from psychologists. They documented changes in sleep well before patients reached a critical condition. The patients dreamed of different places, familiar homes, hospital rooms, streets where they once lived. But in every dream, insects appeared. Spiders, worms, beetles, something small and crawling that filled the space. In their dreams, patients felt the same thing they felt while awake. Movement inside the body. Slow, persistent. The insects around them caused panic, but the real terror came from within. Some patients woke up screaming, drenched in cold sweat. Others woke silently, completely disoriented. The notes indicated that after these dreams, the symptoms intensified. In one of the pathology reports, I found a sentence that had been underlined several times. Damage patterns were inconsistent, as if the internal movement was avoiding previously affected areas. I stared at those words for a long time. They didn't sound like someone describing a process or a disease. They sounded like someone trying to describe behavior. Something that could change direction, and knew where it had already been. We got so absorbed in the records that we lost track of time. The details of the patient's suffering were shocking enough to make our palms sweat and our legs feel weak. Page after page, notebook after notebook. We kept reading, unaware of how exposed we'd become. Then there was a sound. Not sharp, not loud. Just something out of place, something that didn't belong in that silence. Somewhere below us, a door clicked shut, and right after that came footsteps. Slow, heavy, too deliberate to be accidental. I looked at Daniel, and he understood without a word. A routine night patrol. Not early, not late, right on time. We moved fast and without speaking. The notebooks, the journal, the tapes, everything went into the backpack without sorting. Plastic tapped softly against plastic, and every small sound felt painfully loud. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it could be heard from the other end of the building. We slipped out of the office and moved blindly through the corridors, trying not to make a sound. The guard's footsteps were closer than I wanted to admit. At one point, Daniel suddenly pulled me aside under the staircase. We pressed ourselves against the cold wall, hiding in a narrow space where the air was thick and stale. The footsteps drew nearer, close enough that we could hear them clearly. A moment later, the beam of the guard's flashlight swept past us. I held my breath until my head started to spin. One movement, one sound, and we'd be seen. The guard stood there for a few seconds, then turned and headed up the stairs. When the sound of his footsteps began to fade, Daniel touched my shoulder, brief, precise. Time to go. We moved faster than fear should have allowed. The door gave way on the second shove. Cold night air hit my face, sharp and almost painful. We didn't look back until we were in the car and gone from the abandoned parking lot. Only when the building disappeared in the rearview mirror did I realize I'd been clenching my teeth so hard my jaw ached, and that we had taken something with us that was far more than just medical records. We drove to my place. The apartment was quiet and cramped, the way it always felt at night when the city hasn't woken up yet. But you already can't sleep. I pulled an old VCR down from the attic, something the previous tenant had left behind. We laid everything out on the kitchen table. The notebooks, the journal, the tapes, spread them out like we were trying to impose order on something that had none. At first, we went back through the written records, slowly, without commenting. Each notebook held a separate story, not diagnoses, but timelines. How long someone lived after the first symptoms appeared. How their condition changed. When it ended, in the pathology reports, the same phrasing came up again and again, like they were circling the same point without ever finding an answer. I caught myself starting to memorize the names. Then we put in the first tape. The image was grainy, the sound dull. The camera was fixed in place. A person sat in front of it, answering questions we couldn't hear. Their voice was calm, almost detached. They talked about fatigue, about strange sensations in their body, as if describing something ordinary. But their hands kept moving, clenching, unclenching, sliding across their knees. On the next tape, the patient was different. He smiled, cracked jokes, but every so often he froze, as if listening to something inside himself. On the third, a woman spoke in a whisper, even though there was no one else in the room. They all looked different. The only thing they shared was the tone. Calm. Too calm for what they were describing. Daniel suggested turning it off more than once. Each time, I said, "Just one more." It felt like if I stopped watching, something important would slip away. A few days passed after that night when Daniel and I began digging into the records. After watching the tapes, he tried to act like nothing had happened. He joked, made short comments, even tried to frame it all as a strange but closed case. But every time we went back to the notes, he would fall silent mid-sentence. He started avoiding eye contact, washing his hands for a long time, as if after every touch of the notebooks. One evening, he said abruptly that we needed to get rid of all of it. The tapes, the notebooks, the journal, everything. No analysis, no copies. I told him I wasn't ready, that we'd already gone too far to stop now. I wanted to understand what had really happened there. Daniel didn't argue, but after that, something in him changed. He stopped coming over. When he answered calls, he kept it brief, like he was trying to end the conversation quickly. A few times he said he didn't want to read or watch anything anymore. That maybe just having those things around was already a mistake. He started talking about infection, about how we didn't know how it spread, that it might not have been just the patients, but surfaces, air, objects. I treated it as fear, logical, but exaggerated. I told him the records had been sitting there for years, that we'd worn gloves, that it didn't make sense. Daniel listened, but he looked like he'd already made up his mind. Eventually, he stopped responding, first to messages, then to calls. His social media stopped updating. I drove by his place a few times, but the lights were always off. His car never showed up. One day, it hit me that we hadn't spoken in a long time, and that the last thing he'd said to me wasn't a joke or a warning. It was a request to throw everything away, and I hadn't listened. I went to his place a few days after he stopped responding. At first, I kept telling myself he'd just gone somewhere without saying anything or turned his phone off. But the longer the silence dragged on, the worse that explanation sounded even in my own head. When I reached the door, I heard something. The TV was on inside, low, monotonous, like background noise. My first thought was simple, almost comforting. He's home. I knocked. Then knocked again. No answer. I reached for the doorknob and only then noticed the spider. It was sitting right beside the lock, perfectly still, as if someone had carefully placed it there. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it aside and opened the door. The apartment was dark, warm, and hard to breathe in. The TV played in the empty living room, showing something without sound. I took a few steps and turned toward the kitchen. As I cracked the door open, a sharp stench hit me. Daniel was lying on the floor between the table and the cabinets. His eyes were open, glassy. His skin was pale, covered in strange bulges and elongated lumps. I didn't notice the floor right away. First, I noticed movement, small shadows near my shoes, larvae, worms, tiny insects scattered as if they'd appeared only recently. Then, right in front of me, a spider dropped from the ceiling. I jumped back and looked up. The ceiling was moving. Not all at once, patches of it. Spiders, beetles, something small and crawling filled the cracks, the corners, the ventilation grates. There were so many it felt like the surface itself was breathing. My throat tightened, and I screamed sharp, wordless. The background hum of the TV faded, and all I could hear was the skittering of parasites, the tiny, sickening sound of their legs moving. I ran out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind me, and didn't stop until I was outside. I was shaking. I knew I should call the police. I knew it clearly, rationally. But I also knew something else. I was the last person who'd been in contact with him. We'd been there, together. We'd taken those records. I didn't call. I drove home, telling myself that maybe silence could still save me. So, as you've probably already understood, I wasn't the one who called the police. That happened much later, weeks afterward. The neighbors couldn't stand the smell anymore. I learned about it from a short local news brief. No names, no details, just a dry line about a body being found. I recognized the address immediately. Strangely, even then I didn't feel relief. just another emptiness, quickly filled by something else. During those weeks, I barely left my apartment. At first, it felt like a deliberate choice, fewer people, fewer questions. Then, it became routine. I listened to myself constantly, to my skin, to my muscles, to strange sensations I would have ignored before. Sometimes it felt like something was moving under my skin, barely noticeable. I'd freeze and wait. Often, nothing happened. Other times, the sensation returned somewhere else. I couldn't tell whether these were symptoms or just fear taking shape. I started searching for information. In the library, old medical references, reports no one had touched in years. Online forums, archives, discussions of rare dermatological and neurological cases. Nothing matched, or it led nowhere. I caught myself realizing I wasn't looking for a cure. I was looking for confirmation that someone else had already been through this. I avoided doctors on purpose, not because I distrusted medicine, but because I'd already seen how this began. At the nursing home, it had started with small complaints too. They hadn't been taken seriously, and then it was too late. I knew how easily symptoms like these could be explained away as stress, anxiety, psychosomatic issues, and how quickly someone could be isolated for observation. And with each passing day, it became harder to tell where fear ended and where whatever was happening to me actually began. I remember Daniel's funeral in fragments, like watching everything through thick glass. Sounds arrived late. Faces blurred together, words lost their meaning the moment they were spoken. I stood among the crowd and kept realizing that while I was physically there, I was somewhere else entirely. His parents cried openly, without trying to hold it in. His mother barely let go of his father's hand, as if she were afraid of being alone even for a few seconds. There were distant relatives I'd never met before, and our mutual friends repeating the same phrases, never quite meeting anyone's eyes. When it was time to say goodbye, I forced myself to step closer. His face looked calm, too calm. I leaned in to say something, and that's when I saw it. Just beneath his lower eyelid, a small raised spot, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. The skin was slightly tight and faintly moving. A second later, it smoothed out again, as if nothing had been there. I didn't look away right away. I didn't need an explanation. I'd already seen this in the records. Read the descriptions. I knew how it started and how it ended. In that moment, it became clear. He didn't just die. He went through the same thing. I stepped back without saying goodbye out loud. People around me kept crying, talking, hugging each other. And I stood there, realizing that most of these faces were probably only here temporarily, and that whatever had taken Daniel hadn't stopped with him. After the funeral, I went back to the records, not out of curiosity, out of necessity. I needed to put everything into a single picture, even if the result turned out to be worse than not knowing at all. I reread the notebooks from beginning to end, compared dates, symptoms, notes in the margins. I cross-referenced them with what I found online and in archived reports. And little by little, a logic emerged, one that made my skin crawl. This wasn't something that had appeared suddenly. It started with small things, weakened bodies, poor sterilization, constant close contact between people who needed care, old age, compromised immune systems, open micro-injuries, care provided without proper conditions. The infection didn't look aggressive. It didn't kill right away. It took advantage of what it was given. At first, the symptoms were blamed on age, on skin conditions, on nerves, on chronic illness. No one saw a reason to invest in deeper diagnostics. By the time it became clear this wasn't a series of isolated cases, but a pattern, it was already too late. Treatment would have required time, money, and accountability, all things no one wanted to take on. Closing the facility was easier. Those who could still move and appeared stable were distributed to other institutions. No explanations, no warnings. The rest were left behind and then written off. The records stopped exactly where something serious should have begun. That's when I understood the infection hadn't been confined to one place. It traveled with people, slowly, quietly. And if Daniel was now in the ground while I was still reading these records, then the chain hadn't been broken. It had only been stretched out over time. The first clear symptom, the one I couldn't explain away, came at night. Not sharp, not painful. More like a strange shift beneath the skin, deeper than muscle. I froze, held my breath, and waited for it to pass. And it did. I told myself it was tension, exhaustion, too many sleepless nights. But the next day it came back, in a different place, as if something inside me was slowly changing direction, moving through my body, between muscles and organs. One morning, while washing my face, I looked up at the mirror and saw an elongated bulge beneath my eye. It wasn't red or inflamed, just wrong. I stared at it for several seconds without blinking, and right in front of me, it began to shrink. It didn't vanish suddenly, it seemed to retreat inward, shifting slightly toward my nose. Beneath my eye, a brief, precise sensation remained, like a touch from the inside. I didn't scream. I didn't try to interfere. I stood there, completely still, waiting to see what would happen next, unable to move even a finger. The dreams grew heavier. I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. I dreamed of familiar places, but there was always something extra in them, crawling, small, everywhere. I'd wake up abruptly, sit up in bed, stare at my hands, trying to slow my breathing. One day, I noticed several small lumps on my forearm, barely visible, but I knew it wasn't a rash. Without thinking, I reached for the scissors on the table and tried to get rid of them. A burning pain shot through my arm. My vision darkened, but deep inside, I could still feel something crawling. That's when I knew. These were no longer someone else's records. This was my body. I opened the same notebook and added my name to the end of the list. The date. A few lines about the sensations, about the movement, about the lumps that appear and disappear. My hand was shaking, but the writing stayed steady. At the end, I automatically repeated a phrase I'd already seen before. Movement without pain at first. Then I turned on the camera on my phone. I showed my skin. I described how it feels. No emotion. Like a report. Now I'm lying down to sleep, and I don't know what I'll dream about, or whether I'll wake up at all. I've understood only one thing. These aren't isolated cases. The infected could be anywhere, nearby, on public transit, at home. Now you know. So pay attention to yourself, and to the people around you. Tell me honestly, while you were listening to this, did you feel anything? Maybe something moving under your skin? Friends, did you enjoy the story? If you did, make sure to let me know in the comments. I also want to let you know that I've launched a Patreon. That's where you'll find exclusive stories from my horror library, especially the ones YouTube won't allow here. So, subscribe to the channel and join me on Patreon. I'll see you in the next video.